Theories of obligation try to explain how a choice ought to be made for it to be a good choice. So we are looking at a reasoning system that can be used to establish the righteousness of an act or of an agent that performs the act. How do choices happen? An agent makes a choice, and then choice has some consequences. Now, what of these elements of a situation is that it determines the morality of a choice? Now, you have three options here, and I have highlighted them with different colors. If we assume that it is who makes the choice that determines the morality of the choice itself, then we talk about virtue theories, virtue ethics. If it is the choice itself that can be good and bad, and that is what determines the morality of the choice and nothing else, then we are talking about deontological theories. Lastly, if we are assuming that it is not who chooses or what is chosen, but what are the consequences of the choice that has the biggest impact on whether that choice should be considered moral or not, then we are talking about consequentialist theories. Now, since consequentialist theories really have like a special place in machine ethics, I'm going to start with consequential theories and introduce deontological theories, and then lastly, virtue theories. There are two consequentialist theories that I will mention here very, very briefly, quick and dirty. The first one is called ethical egoism, and the second one is called utilitarianism. Ethical egoism stipulates that the moral right choice is the one that advances one's own best interests. Now, note that one's own best interests are not necessarily self-interests. This, we believe, is called psychological egoism or something like that. So in order to, how do you know that the choice is right to be made? Then you ask yourself, well, does this advance my interest? Does this do what I want to accomplish? It may seem completely crazy that this is like an ethical theory, but it is very much aligned with applicability. It's very much easy to explain that something should be done because we feel like it in a way and we want to do it. So it is very easy for a person to follow this theory, and this is one of the greatest advantages of it. Of course, there are issues with ethical egoism, specifically, what if advancing my interests hurts your interests? And for this reason, it's not really quite up there when we think about what moral behavior actually is. But it is interesting for machine ethics because machines are actually built to advance our own abilities and interests, right? So we do automation in order to advance our interests. Now, of course, then building a machine that reasons about morality should also reason about morality in a way that advances the interests of a person who has built that machine or a person who is using that machine. And here right away we run into the issue of that is specific for ethical egoism for machine ethics, but doesn't exist in ethical egoism when we talk about people as agents. The issue is whose best interests are we talking about? And this is not at all a trivial issue, and I will talk more about this in the next part of this tutorial, which is social choice and machine ethics. How do we figure out whose interests should we be advancing? The second consequentialist theory is the one that we typically do think about when we think about moral theories, and this is utilitarianism. Utilitarianism is the theory that asserts that the moral right action is the one that produces the most favorable balance of good over evil, everyone considered. So how do I know what to do? Well, I consider my options and I see for each of the options, which is the option that maximizes the good for everyone considered, in contrast to ethical egoism, where the option that is best to do is the one that advances only my good over evil. There are two types of consequentialist theories. The first one is called act utilitarianism, and the second one is called rule utilitarianism. So very briefly, let's see what those are. Actually, utilitarianism looks at the consequences of each choice that is taken in separation. So every time I need to make a choice, I consider whether this choice, what good this choice advances, what bad consequences it has, and compare this to all the other options that they have available. In contrast, rule utilitarianism looks at the consequences of having a choice being taken by everyone all the time. So why do we want to do this? Because we'll discuss this a little bit more in a bit, but very quickly here, we very quickly will start asking ourselves, how feasible is it to actually consider all the choices all the time and all the consequences of these choices all the time. So rule utilitarianism has been introduced to mellow out this very drastic demand of constant consideration of consequences of all the actions that we are about to take, and takes a little bit of a shortcut and says, well, how about a general rule of thumb that we can follow without specifically dissecting every single option all the times. So a little bit more specific, act utilitarianism is the theory that the morally right actions are those that directly produce the greatest overall good, everyone considered, and rule utilitarianism is the theory that the morally right action is the one covered by a rule that, if generally followed, would produce most balance. So we are looking for like a general rule over in order to be able to be more efficient with our time when we consider all the possible consequences of all the possible options that we make all the time. So, I mean, act utilitarianism will have you consider, oh, I am thirsty, should I have a drink of water? Or I am hungry, should I eat this food? Should I maybe eat this food now? Should I eat it in 15 minutes, and so on? So it gets very overwhelming very fast. Act utilitarianism is due to Jeremy Bentham, so just some background information if you want to get into it. And he considered that the greatest happiness, to seek what is right, you have to seek what brings about the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people. And to do this, he recognizes that you have to have a way to rank among pleasures and pains among people and in the world. The issue is that you have to not only consider consequences of every single action that you are going to take or every single option that you're going to choose from, but you also have to consider the consequences of those consequences and the consequences of those consequences of the consequences, and it's perhaps unfeasible to do that all the time for everything. And you will never choose anything if you have to be stuck into this perpetual evaluation of consequences of consequences of consequences. So rule utilitarianism comes a little bit later to somewhat ameliorate this. It is due to John Stuart Mill, who stipulates that you first should examine how much good an action does and then see what happens if everyone follows that action as a rule. So then when you are in a bind and you don't know what to choose, what is morally right, then you can fall back on these rules that have already been considered and say, well, if this option follows this rule, and we know that this rule maximizes the happiness for the greatest number of people or for the all people considered. Utilitarianism has a special role to play in machine ethics. If we solve the problem of measuring goodness and badness, there is really no reason why we cannot write an algorithm that makes choices that maximize it. So we often find this observation is the first thing that people think about when we think about automatizing ethical reasoning. And it has been a very popular topic in science fiction in general, so I couldn't resist. Here I link an excerpt from the iRobot video on YouTube, in which the main character is devastated because the robot has actually used utilitarianism in order to save the life of a child, which the main protagonist thinks is the wrong thing to do, actually. But back to reality, people are not necessarily comfortable with utilitarianism, particularly because it requires you to do this moral arithmetics. It requires you to compare the welfare of some people over other people and transform things that maybe should not be transformable. But as those people who consider that utilitarianism is perhaps not the best approach to deciding whether we should do something or not for people, they may consider that it is actually a good choice for machines. So I will just point to this work here that explores the issue of what type of moral behavior do people expect from a machine in contrast with what they expect from a person to follow. Of course, that I cannot emphasize that enough, because there are too many papers that I'm reviewing which say, well, assume that we can measure the happiness of everyone, then we have this utility, then how do we go about using this utility to implement moral reasoning to automate it, right? We cannot just glance over this problem of measuring happiness or pain. Utility allows us to compare choices. This is essential of the theory, but we do not intuitively necessarily consider that all choices should be compared. So per utilitarian theory, we are able to compare how many damages to my property is equally morally wrong as murdering a child, right? So in our mind, murder is a completely different category of badness, if you like, than damage of property. But under utilitarian theory, there is a particular amount of damage to property which actually equals someone's life, and people are not necessarily comfortable squaring this one off. However, may not be an issue for machine ethics. People may be actually expecting and wanting that a machine behaves ethically under utilitarian theory. Now, the best way to explain, I couldn't resist, the best way to explain the issues with utilitarianism is to rely on the professionals of sarcasm. So I'm not sure whether this should be done or can be done, but I'm doing it anyway. So this is Saturday morning breakfast cereal comics, and I find that they very often have in-depth satirical explorations of moral philosophy that are very pertinent for machine ethics. In fact, they have quite a lot of comics that are pertaining to machine ethics specifically. So in this one, they evaluate basically utilitarianism. So I was just going to go through the panels here because they're very interesting, and we can't just be talking philosophy all the time. So this is a guy introducing what he calls the ethical Fourier transform. He says, suppose we've got an ethical conundrum. Instead of solving it, convert it to the realm of economics. Having solved it there, declare it to be solved, to be a solved ethical problem. And this is what the people who oppose utilitarianism actually claim. So example, suppose you're piloting a trolley, it's headed towards 5 people. You can change course to kill 1, or you can leave it on its course and it will kill 5, famous trolley problem. And of course, the argument here is, I don't know, life is special. It's like asking whether 1 infinity is as big as 5 infinities. Like, who are we to choose between lives, right? So exactly, it's unsolvable, but we can calculate the damage to the trolley, which is derived from the mass of the special human lives. Thus, it is best to kill only 1 person. Now, this is a terrible method, of course. It doesn't even solve basic virtue problems, like whether you can steal bread to feed your family. So is the action of stealing bread to feed your family moral or not? So what a utilitarianist would do here is, let me check today's grain market prices, and yes, it will be ethical to steal bread to feed your family until mid-November. Of course, somebody might feel that it should always be ethical to steal to eat. And of course it is for potatoes, corn, and some varieties of rice. So of course, then you will see, well, moral truth doesn't hinge on pricing of commodities. But in contrast, we can ask, well, is it ethical to steal truffle and mushrooms and champagne to feed your family? So if it is ethical to steal to feed your family, we can agree on that. But then what is stolen is this luxury goods. So is it still ethical? And somehow we'll already start to falter here. I don't know. So honestly, that somehow does feel like a different matter than the bread, and it weirds us out. This is where utilitarianism is perhaps considered to be the dark side of moral philosophy.